Hey guys, welcome to my video for UFC on ESPN Fight Night Vera versus Sandhagen. I'm actually really excited for this one because I feel like this is going to be the first good event of the whole year. So far all the events this year I feel like they've been kind of slapped together. A lot of bum fights where there's like heavy favorites versus big underdogs. Not that there aren't any of that on this card, but I do feel that most of the fights on this card are more competitive. There's like more 50-50 fights here than other cards this year. This one's taking place in Texas, which I don't really pay attention to ever. It's not in the Apex, which I think will be good this time because I feel like Texas usually has a good role with UFC events. The last time they were in Texas, they also delivered on a pretty good card, and I'm pretty sure that's what's going to happen here. Anyway, just to recap last week's event, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of lackluster. Solid 6 out of 10 of a card. The prelims were okay, I guess. The early prelims were so. The middle prelims were kind of better, and the main card was, I don't know, lackluster. I feel like there were maybe a few botched decisions on the main card. I feel like Roman Dolidze and Rafael Fiziev should have both won their fights, but I don't know. I don't really feel strongly towards that in either way. The main event was actually really funny. I don't understand. I know that there was a point deduction, but I don't understand the 48-46. Where that came from. There was a random draw as well, and also, shout out to Gamblin Urbdeen for trying to for trying to make the fight go his way. I know he had a few bets running on that fight, but anyway, let's get into the picks, and yeah. Alright, so the first of my picks will be for Vinicius Salvador versus Victor Altaminaro. Starting off, this is honestly one of my least confident picks on this card. This is a pretty hard fight to call because both of these guys are bums who have some pretty questionable records. I think there's a true 50-50 between these guys. I just wish that we could have this 50-50 stat for more fights all throughout the all throughout the UFC, but whatever. I know that Altaminaro has a win, has a UFC win under his belt, but we also have to consider that the guy he was fighting is also another newcomer who went 0-3 in the UFC and is also on his way out. Also, he's a guy with an already questionable chin. Anyway, Salvador has a lot of finishes under his belt, and he does have 1 or 2 good wins in his record, mixed with the wins over newcomers. Salvador is on the younger side here, and he has a pretty good recovery time from what I've seen. And in his fights, he usually capitalizes on a finish rather than fumbling it. I think that if he can get Altaminaro down, he can probably get the finish here. My only pick for this fight is like a really risky, slight favor towards the Vinicius Salvador moneyline. So the next fight I have is Manuel Torres versus Trey Ogden. This is another one that I'm not very confident about, but this is the last one that I feel that way about anyway. Fights like this between newcomer bums are always kind of hard to call because I feel like this is the only time we can commonly get a true like 50-50 matchup. Most of the fights in the UFC and the ESPN era so far have been just like talent that UFC favors versus a newcomer bum who's going to be cut within 2 to 3 fights anyway. So my pick for this fight is either Torres by finish or Ogden by decision. Torres is a supposedly new and exciting prospect in the UFC. He has a taste for finishes and not too bad record that I would like to see in more newcomers. He's expected to like at least knock out his opponents. Ogden has a very weird style of fighting. I think his main weapon is to like confuse his opponents and to use them second guessing their shit to his advantage. He has a lot of experience in MMA and has a pretty tricky style of fighting. I think the first round will be the most dangerous round for Ogden, but if he can survive that, I can see him coasting to a decision win. Alright, so my next pick is for CJ Vergara versus Daniel Da Silva, and I'm not gonna lie, this pick is based purely on how bad of a fighter I think Daniel Da Silva is. I think Vergara is a bit of a bum. He has a questionable record with some padding here and there, but somehow Da Silva's record is even worse. Like, getting a sub over a guy who has a 13-12 record, whose previous opponent was a guy with a 4-2 record coming into the fight, doesn't really mean shit. And Vergara has had an okay tenure in the UFC so far. Like, he's developed one of my favorite things in MMA, which is a win-loss record. And I truly believe that these are the most reliable indicators for whether or not the next fight is going to be a win or loss for any fighter, really. Anyway, his last fight was a loss, and I'm certain that this one's going to be a win. But let's get back to De Silva. Coming into the UFC, his record was pretty much just getting wins over fresh newcomers or guys with really bad losing streaks. In his UFC tenure, he's gone the route of a typical ESPN-era signing. Like, we've seen this many times before. A newcomer who's only there to fill in the numbers in the prelims. So far, he's gone 0-3 in the UFC, and he's lost in some pretty bad ways. He's been finished all 3 times. He's become a stepping stone for other newcomers to get some traction on them. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if he were to get cut after this fight, and I do think that a few other fighters in this card is going to get cut after the card's over. Anyway, my pick for this fight is for CJ Vergara to win inside the distance, and I think this is going to be a second or third round KO TKO. Okay, so my next pick is for Trevin Giles, whatever, versus Preston Parsons. This is going to be another bump fight, but this one is of a slightly higher caliber. I'll start off by stating that my pick for Trevin Giles is to win by decision. This one is going to be pretty easy to call, as I feel like this is going to be a gimme fight for Giles. He's been in the UFC for a minute, and over the years, he's accumulated some good wins. Lately, though, he looks like he's fallen off just a little bit. He did lose to a few newcomers, so I think the UFC is throwing him a bone by matching him up with someone who I think is too green for the UFC. His last win was over the very overrated Louis Kosei, whatever, dude. And I think his opponent this time, Preston Parsons, is very similar. A lot like Kosei, Parsons starts off with high striking volume and has the ability to switch it up a little bit, implementing his wrestling and all that. But the thing is, he slows down really quickly. Giles, with all of his experience and proficiency standing up and on the ground, has the skill to shut down an opponent's game, to a certain degree, level, whatever. He fights a methodic fight and can confuse his opponents, something that will come easily to him in this fight as he's fighting a newcomer. Giles was actually doing good against Dricus Du Plessis. I believe Du Plessis got the KO there while in Kill or Die mode. His win over Roman Dolidze was also a pretty good one. He implemented his ground game pretty well in that fight. I think the same thing will happen against Parsons. I think we'll see Giles confuse and wear down Parsons with his ground game, which in turn will allow him to coast to a unanimous decision win. Okay, my next pick is for Steven Peterson versus Lucas Alexander, and for this fight, my pick is for Steven Peterson to win inside the distance. Lucas Alexander is a newcomer to the UFC. He debuted a short notice fight against Joanderson Brito and lost, but that's to be expected when you're fighting as a late replacement. He did lose in a pretty bad way, though. It didn't look like he even put up that much of a fight and pretty much just let Brito get the sub on him. Other than that, he does have one of the worst pre-UFC records I've seen. He hasn't beaten anybody with a good record and lost to people with some pretty bad records. All in all, I'm just not going to rate a guy whose best win is over a guy whose record is 8-5, and he beat him when he was on a 4-fight losing streak. The second best guy he's fought has a record of 6-7, and he beat him on a 6-fight losing streak. Anyway, Steven Alexander, on the other hand, has a deceptively good record. I think that it looks bad from afar when you see all the losses, but you also have to consider who he was fighting. He's fought against guys like Julian Erosa, Alex Caceres, and to a lesser degree, Chase Hooper. I feel like he should have gotten finished by those guys, but he hung on and he gave them all pretty competitive fights. I remember in his fight with Julian Erosa, I thought that it was a fight that Peterson won. Anyway, Erosa ended up winning by a split decision. But Erosa did try to finish him multiple times, and I would say that Peterson is one of the harder fighters to finish. I would say that this is a step down in competition for Steven Peterson. Alexander is certainly not on the level of an Erosa or Caceres. I think that this fight is not going to go the distance. Peterson by finish looks like a good bet to me. Alright, so the next one is Daniel Pineda versus Tucker Lutz, and for this one, I'm picking Tucker Lutz to win inside the distance. I'll start off with Pineda for this one. I think that he's a very Njoukani-esque fighter, like one of the gassiest guys I've seen in the UFC. He starts off his fights very well, like he throws a lot of punches and a lot of good leg kicks and makes him competitive. He's also a good grappler, I'll give him that, but it's also not something that I'll be expecting a lot in this fight, or in any of his other fights due to his gas issue. I think he might try to grapple in the first round, but I don't think he'll try it further because I doubt he's going to have any gas left to do so. A lot like Njoukani, he has a few first round finishes because that's when he's the most dangerous. So far, what we've seen of him in the UFC is him fighting well for the first round and then succumbing to a finish in the second. Also, in addition to being a gaslit, he also got popped for roiding in the PFL. Anyway, let's move on to Tucker Lutz. I don't think he's anything to write home about. He's like not the best or the worst, but he is a competent fighter. If he has anything over Pineda in this fight, it's his gas tank. I remember Lutz's previous fight. It was a fight against Pat Sabatini. I remember betting on him in that fight. I'm betting on Sabatini on that fight, and I thought that Sabatini would win by finish, but instead he won by decision. Lutz actually impressed me in that fight because despite losing, he did show his proficiency on the ground. He spent 3 rounds with Sabatini on the ground, and he didn't gas or tap, which I think is a pretty good look for a fighter. I want to say that Lutz will get the finish here, and it is very likely, but I think he's a bit more comfortable going to decision. It all depends on how the first round goes. Just to be safe, I'll call it Tucker Lutz moneyline. Okay, so for my last pick of the card, we're going to go with Chidi Njoukani versus Albert Duraev. And for this one, I'm going to go with Chidi Njoukani by finish. I don't really rate Duraev highly. I don't think he's that good on either the feet or the ground. I think he can wrestle a little bit, but I don't think it's nearly enough to get him through a whole fight. I thought that he would do a lot better against Joaquin Buckley, but honestly, it didn't look like he had anything for him. He looked like he was just getting beat up the whole fight. Anyway, I think Chidi Njoukani is one of the best recent additions to the UFC roster as a whole. If I had to compare him to someone, I'd say that he's a lot like RoboCop Gregory Rodriguez, ironically the guy he lost to last time. He has a lot of experience outside the UFC, and he doesn't really waste too much of his time. In fact, in all of his fights, I've seen him be able to get a quick read on all of his opponents and implement his game plan into getting the result that he wants, which is usually a knockout. And I think this guy, along with Rodriguez, are shoo-ins for the rank class of their division. I'm sure that after this fight, he's going to get promoted to the top 15, which I don't think should be that hard because 185 is already a bum-ass division. Anyway, even in his fight with Rodriguez, he was getting some good shots off, and it sort of became like a back-and-forth brawl in which he ended up getting knocked out. Anyway, I think he's well experienced and has fought top-level competition before the UFC, and I have no doubt Chidi will get the finish here. And I think that this is going to be an early one, so I'm guessing either round 1 or round 2 finish by Chidi. Okay, so that about wraps up my picks for this card. 7 out of 13 fights, which I don't think is too bad. 7's a big number, but anyway, yeah, this card looks really good. Competitive prelim section, and the main card also looks competitive. Maybe the placement for some of these fights are a bit out of whack. Like, I feel like Alex Perez versus Manuel Cup should be a little bit higher, like where the Nate Landwehr versus Austin Lingo fight is, or even the co-main, but I understand you have to take Holly Holmes' star factor into consideration. I don't feel too strongly about any of these fights on the main card. I will be watching them for fun, but whatever. I don't know, I can see Holly Holm probably getting a finish over Yana Kunitz. Oh, it's Yana Santos now. Over Yana Santos, and yeah, I'm pretty excited to see in what way Macy Barber will lose. But either way, pretty good card, and yeah, enjoy the fights.